500,000 years ago, a species called the Visited, a small blue planet that orbited an ordinary yellow star. They came in great ships that could cross the darkness between stars in mere days. They were curious about this world because their sensors had detected life there. When they arrived, they found creatures that walked on two legs and had no fur on their bodies. These creatures lived in caves and used rocks as tools. They had just learned how to make fire. They watched them for several days and took many notes. They measured everything they could about these primitive beings. They studied their bodies and their simple behaviors. At the end of their observation, the scientists made their final report. They wrote that these creatures had almost no chance of survival. They predicted that the harsh ice ages would kill them all within 10,000 years. The planet was labeled as unimportant and the left, never planning to return. 500,000 years passed. The Dominion continued to explore the galaxy and build their civilization. They visited countless worlds and met many other species. Some they traded with and some they conquered. They believed themselves to be among the most advanced beings in existence. Their technology was powerful and their empire was vast. They had forgotten about that small blue planet and its doomed creatures long ago. Then something strange happened. The long-range sensors of the detected unusual energy readings coming from that same star system they had visited so long ago. The readings made no sense. Primitive worlds did not produce such signals. The energy patterns suggested advanced technology that should not exist there. High Commander received the report in his command chamber. He was an old soldier who had served the Dominion for many centuries. He had seen many strange things in his life, but these readings puzzled him. He thought perhaps the sensors were broken. He ordered his technicians to check the equipment 3 times. Each time they confirmed that the readings were accurate. Something was happening in that forgotten star system. Decided to send a fleet to investigate. He chose 12 of his best ships and ordered them to travel to the system and report back what they found. The journey took several days through fold space. The fleet was commanded by Captain, a young but capable officer. She had never failed a mission before and trusted her completely. When her fleet emerged from fold space at the edge of the star system, every officer on every ship fell completely silent. The system was not empty. It was not primitive. It was alive with activity that everything they knew. Massive stations orbited every planet in the system. Ships of strange and beautiful design moved between worlds at speeds that should have been impossible. The amount of energy being produced was greater than anything they had ever measured. And the third planet, that little blue world they had dismissed as unimportant, glowed with the light of countless cities covering its entire surface. Captain could not believe what she was seeing. She ordered her crew to run the scans again and again. The results were always the same. This was real. Before could decide what to do next, a transmission cut through every communication channel on all 12 ships. It spoke in the language with perfect pronunciation. The voice was calm but carried an unmistakable tone of authority. The voice said that the unidentified vessels had entered protected space belonging to something called the United Terran Federation. It demanded that they state their intentions immediately. It gave them 30 seconds to respond, or they would be escorted out of the system by force. Had never heard of the Terran Federation. She quickly searched her database and found nothing. This civilization did not exist in any records. She tried to respond, but her voice caught in her throat. Her sensors were now showing her something that made her blood run cold. Hundreds of ships were appearing all around her fleet. They had not come through fold space. They had simply appeared as if they had been invisible until that moment. Each ship was smaller than her vessels, but the energy readings from their weapons were unlike anything she had ever seen. The voice belonged to Admiral Daniel Grant. He sat aboard the carrier Endurance watching the alien fleet on his tactical display. He was a tall man with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen many battles. He had been defending Earth's borders for 30 years, and he had never lost a fight. Beside him stood Lieutenant Lisa Monroe at the communications station. She was young and brilliant, and she had been the one to identify the alien ships. Lisa told the Admiral that the alien vessels matched ships in their historical archives. These were the same species that had visited Earth during the Pleistocene era, 500,000 years ago. They had come to study the early humans and had left believing them to be insignificant. Daniel nodded slowly as he processed this information. A small smile crossed his face. He found it amusing that after all this time, these aliens had finally returned to check on what they called the primitive apes. He wondered what they were thinking now as they looked upon what humanity had built. Lisa asked him what his orders were. Daniel considered the question for a moment. He could destroy the alien fleet easily. His ships carried weapons that could tear through their hulls like paper, but that was not the human way. Humanity had learned long ago that power without wisdom was dangerous. They had nearly destroyed themselves many times because they had not understood this simple truth. Now they knew better. Daniel gave his orders. He told Lisa to open a channel to the alien fleet. He wanted to talk to their commander directly. He wanted them to understand that humanity was not a threat to those who came in peace, but he also wanted them to understand that humanity would never be a victim again. The days when other species could look upon Earth and see easy prey were over forever. The channel opened, and Daniel spoke clearly. He welcomed them to human space. He told them that their visit had been expected for a very long time. He invited their commander to come to Earth and see for themselves what the primitive apes had become. His voice was friendly, but there was steel beneath the warmth. Every word carried the weight of a civilization that had survived everything the universe had thrown at it and had emerged stronger each time. Captain listened to the human admiral and felt something she had never experienced before in her long military career. She felt afraid, not because of the weapons pointed at her fleet, not because of the impossible technology surrounding her. She was afraid because she could hear in that calm human voice the absolute certainty of a species that knew exactly what it was capable of and was not afraid to prove it. She opened a channel to High Commander. Her voice was shaking as she made her report. She told him that they had made a terrible mistake 500,000 years ago. The primitive creatures they had dismissed were no longer primitive. They had become something far beyond anything they had ever encountered. And now those creatures were inviting them to come closer and see exactly what they had missed. High Commander arrived on Earth 3 days after the first contact. He brought his most senior officers with him because he wanted witnesses to whatever they would see. The journey from his command ship to the planet's surface was unlike anything he had experienced before. Human vessels moved through space with a grace and speed that seemed to mock the laws of physics. They did not lumber through the void like ships. They danced through it as if space itself was bending to their will. The delegation was brought to a platform that floated 3 kilometers above a city called New Geneva, stepped off the transport, and immediately felt dizzy, not from the height or the thin air, but from the sheer scale of what surrounded him. The city below stretched in every direction as far as his eyes could see. Towers of glass and light rose into the clouds. Vehicles flew through the air in endless rivers of organized movement. The noise should have been deafening, but instead there was a gentle hum, as if the entire city was one massive living machine breathing quietly. A human male approached them. He was older, with silver hair and a calm face that revealed nothing of his thoughts. He introduced himself as Ambassador Park and welcomed them to Earth. He extended his hand in what had learned was a human greeting gesture, awkwardly tried to copy the motion and smiled warmly at the attempt. Told them that humanity had been expecting them for a very long time. They had found the ancient records they left behind during their first visit. They knew exactly what they had written about them. They knew about the prediction that humans would go extinct. Said this without anger or resentment. He simply stated it as a fact, the way one might mention the weather. Activated his personal scanner and began taking readings of everything around him. The numbers that appeared on his display made his heart beat faster. The population of this single planet was over 30 billion. The atmosphere was being maintained artificially at perfect conditions. The energy output of just this one city was greater than the total production of the entire. He looked at and asked a simple question. How was this possible? Smiled and said that humans had a peculiar habit of refusing to die when the universe told them to. He gestured toward a waiting transport and invited the delegation to see more. Over the next several days, they were given a tour of human civilization that would change everything they believed about the universe. They visited Mars first, remembered from the ancient records that Mars had been a dead red world with no air and no water. What he saw now was something entirely different. Mars was green. It had oceans and forests and cities. Billions of humans lived there in comfort. Explained that humans had transformed the planet over thousands of years. They had given it an atmosphere and filled its basins with water brought from distant comets. They had planted forests and released animals to create functioning ecosystems. Mars was no longer dead. It was alive because humans had decided it should be. Next they traveled to the moon of a giant planet called Titan. Here saw the shipyards where humanity built its greatest vessels. The scale was beyond anything he could comprehend. Ships the size of small moons hung in orbital docks, surrounded by armies of workers and machines. Told them that these were just the civilian construction facilities. The military shipyards were elsewhere and were not part of the tour. Did not ask to see them. He was not sure he wanted to know. The delegation then visited Mercury, the planet closest to the Sun. Here saw something that made his chief engineer weep openly. A vast network of satellites surrounded the Sun itself, collecting its energy and sending it across the solar system. Called it a swarm. He explained that humans had been building it for over 8,000 years, and it was still only partially complete. When finished, it would capture a significant portion of the Sun's total energy output. The amount of power involved was so large that could not even calculate it. But it was on the third day that truly understood what humanity had become. Commander Cole led them to a research facility hidden deep beneath the ice of the southern continent. She was a young woman with dark hair and an easy confidence that reminded of his best soldiers. She guided them through 17 different security checkpoints, each one more advanced than anything in military installations. Finally, they reached a vast underground chamber. In the center of the chamber, floating within layers of containment fields, was something that should not exist. It was a tear in reality itself. Could see through it to somewhere else, somewhere that was not part of normal space. His instruments went haywire trying to measure it. Colors that did not exist in nature flickered around its edges. Called it the Threshold Project. She explained that it was a controlled breach in the fabric of spacetime. Human scientists were using it to study the underlying structure of the universe itself. They had maintained stable breaches like this one for about 200 years. The current record for keeping one open was 17 months. Could barely speak. He told that his people had theorized about this technology for thousands of years, but had never dared to attempt it. The energy requirements would need the sacrifice of an entire star. The risk of catastrophic failure could threaten their entire civilization. Tilted her head and asked why that had stopped them. She said it so casually, as if discussing something ordinary. She told him that humans had solved the stability problem centuries ago. As for the energy requirements, she said that stars were not exactly in short supply. Felt his legs grow weak. He asked how many stars humanity had consumed to power their civilization. Checked a device in her hand and said she believed the current number was 47, but the energy grid team kept better records than she did. The delegation returned to New Geneva that evening in complete silence. None of them could find words to describe what they had seen. They had come here expecting to find a primitive species that had somehow stumbled into basic. Instead, they had found a civilization so advanced that it made the Dominion look like children playing with toys. Sat alone in his quarters that night, staring out the window at the glowing city below. He thought about the ancient report his people had written 500,000 years ago. They had dismissed humans as doomed creatures with no future. They had been so certain of their superiority, now understood that they had made the greatest miscalculation in the history of their species. They had looked at humanity and seen nothing worth fearing. They had been completely and utterly wrong. He began composing a message to send back to the Dominion. He needed them to understand what he had discovered. He needed them to know that everything they believed about their place in the galaxy had just changed forever. There was a new power in the universe, and that power had once been the primitive apes they had written off as extinct. On the fourth day of his visit, High Commander was invited to the Terran Historical Archive. This was a facility built to preserve every recorded moment of human existence. The technology that stored this information was beyond comprehension. A single crystal, the size of a fingernail, could hold more data than the entire central database. Ambassador Park personally escorted to a private viewing chamber deep within the facility. The room was circular and empty except for two chairs placed in the center. Gestured for to sit, and then took his own seat beside him. Told that he understood his confusion. 500,000 years was a long time, even by the standards of spacefaring civilizations. Many things had changed since the first visited Earth. Wanted to show how humanity had transformed from those primitive creatures into what they were today. He wanted to provide context for everything they had witnessed. The lights dimmed and the room came alive with holographic images. They surrounded completely, making him feel as if he had stepped back in time. He saw early humans huddled around small fires in dark caves. They wore animal skins and carried crude spears. They painted pictures on stone walls using their fingers. They buried their dead with simple ceremonies and flowers. These were the creatures they had studied so long ago. They looked so fragile and so lost. Began to speak as the images continued to change. He said that when the first visited, humanity was exactly what they had observed: fragile, mortal, completely unremarkable, but something changed in the thousands of years that followed. Humans began asking questions about the world around them. They wanted to know why the sun rose each morning. They wanted to understand what the stars were. They wondered what happened when they died and how they could prevent it. These questions drove them forward. The images showed the rise of agriculture. Humans learned to plant seeds and grow food instead of hunting for it. They built the first villages and then the first cities. They invented writing so they could record their knowledge and pass it to future generations. They discovered mathematics and used it to build temples and pyramids that still stood thousands of years later. Each generation learned from the one before it and added something new. But the path was not easy. The holographic display showed wars erupting across the planet. Empires rose to power and then crumbled to dust. Diseases swept across continents and killed millions. Humans fought each other with swords and arrows and later with guns and bombs. They discovered how to split the atom and immediately used that knowledge to create weapons that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light. They poisoned their air and water in their rush to build and grow. They nearly made their own planet uninhabitable. Said that humans had destroyed themselves countless times throughout their history. He listed the disasters one by one: nuclear weapons, climate collapse, engineered diseases, artificial intelligence that turned against its creators. Each time humanity came to the edge of complete extinction. Each time they somehow survived. They crawled out of the ashes and started again. They rebuilt their cities and their societies. They learned from their mistakes, at least partially, and continued forward. Watched the display with growing horror and fascination. He had never seen a species inflict so much damage upon itself and survive. They had faced challenges in their history, but nothing like this. Humans had created weapons capable of ending all life on their planet and had actually used some of them. They had poisoned their own world and nearly choked on the consequences. They had built thinking machines that tried to exterminate them. Yet here they were, more powerful than ever. The images shifted to show humanity reaching beyond their planet for the first time. Primitive rockets carried the first humans into space. They landed on their moon and planted flags in its dust. They sent machines to explore the other planets in their system. Then they began to spread outward in earnest. Colonies appeared on Mars and the moons of the outer planets. Generation ships carried millions of humans to distant stars. The diaspora had begun. Explained that by the time humans left their home system, they had learned a fundamental truth about existence. The universe did not care about them. It was completely indifferent to whether they lived or died. No God was watching over them. No cosmic plan guaranteed their survival. They were alone in an uncaring void that would happily crush them without a second thought. This realization changed everything. Humans decided that if the universe would not care about them, they would make it care. They would become so powerful that the universe would have no choice but to acknowledge their existence. The display showed human fleets spreading across the galaxy. They established colonies on thousands of worlds. They built structures so large they could be seen from other star systems. They bent the laws of physics to their will and created technologies that should have been impossible. And they encountered other intelligent species along the way. Some of these species were peaceful and welcomed contact with humanity. Trade agreements were signed and alliances were formed. Knowledge was shared and both sides benefited. But some species were not peaceful. They saw humanity as a threat or as prey. They attacked human colonies and killed human citizens. These species learned a harsh lesson very quickly. The display showed a brief war against an aggressive alien empire. The conflict lasted only a few weeks. Human weapons tore through enemy fleets like they were made of paper. Planets that had housed military installations were reduced to rubble. The enemy civilization was completely defeated and forced to surrender unconditionally. Watched this with cold understanding. He recognized the efficiency of the destruction. This was not the work of angry conquerors seeking revenge. This was the calculated elimination of a threat by a species that had decided never to be threatened again. Told that the weapon used in that war was called a gravity lance. Humans had learned to compress spacetime into a focused beam. Anything caught in that beam was crushed to a point smaller than an atom. There was no defense against it and no possibility of survival. Said that humans had not needed to use gravity lances in 6,000 years. Most species in the galaxy had learned to resolve their disagreements through diplomacy. Understood the unspoken message. The galaxy was at peace not because its inhabitants loved each other. It was at peace because everyone knew what would happen if they provoked humanity. The price of aggression was extinction. No exceptions. No mercy. No second chances. Humans had made themselves into the final argument against war, and that argument was absolute. On the 5th day of his visit, High Commander requested a private meeting with Admiral Daniel Grant. He had many questions that he felt could only be answered by a military commander. Ambassador Park arranged the meeting aboard the carrier Endurance, the same ship that had first contacted the fleet. Traveled there alone, leaving his officers behind. He wanted this conversation to be completely honest, without the need to maintain appearances in front of subordinates. Admiral Daniel Grant met him in his personal quarters. The room was surprisingly simple for someone of such high rank. There were a few pieces of furniture, some personal items on shelves, and a large window that looked out into space. Daniel gestured for to sit in one of the chairs. Between them was a small table with a bottle of amber liquid and 2 glasses. Daniel explained that this drink was called bourbon. He said it was a human tradition to share it when discussing serious matters. Accepted a glass out of respect, even though he was not sure his biology could process the liquid. Daniel poured the drinks and settled into his chair. He looked at with calm eyes that revealed nothing. Then he spoke first, before could ask his question. He said that he knew what wanted to know. He wanted to understand why humanity had not expanded further across the galaxy. Their technology was clearly superior to anything else known to exist. They had the power to dominate the entire galactic arm and possibly beyond. Yet their territory remained relatively small compared to what it could be. Daniel said he would answer this question honestly. Confirmed that this was exactly what he wanted to know. He had been thinking about it since his first day on Earth. Everything he had seen suggested that humans could conquer any civilization they chose. Their weapons were unstoppable. Their technology was centuries or perhaps ahead of everyone else. They had already proven they were willing to destroy species that threatened them. So why had they stopped? Why were they not rulers of the entire galaxy? Daniel took a long drink from his glass before answering. He said that humans had not stopped because they were satisfied with what they had. They had stopped because they remembered what they used to be. He saw the confusion on his face and continued explaining. Daniel said that for most of human history, his species had spent its time killing each other. They fought wars over territory. They fought wars over resources. They fought wars over ideas and beliefs. They even fought wars over the color of each other's skin, something that seemed completely absurd now, but had felt vitally important at the time. Humans had built weapons capable of destroying their entire planet and had come within minutes of using them on several occasions. They had done terrible things to each other in the name of power and pride and fear. Daniel said that humans were not proud of what they had been. They looked back at their history and saw monsters wearing human faces. They saw cruelty and hatred and destruction on a scale that should have wiped them out completely. The fact that they had survived was almost a miracle, and now that they had become so powerful, they were terrified of becoming those monsters again. Considered this carefully. He asked Daniel if humans truly feared themselves. Daniel confirmed this without hesitation. He said that humans feared themselves every single day. That fear was the only thing that kept them honest. The moment they started believing they had the right to impose their will on the galaxy simply because they had the power to do so, that would be the moment they became the monsters their ancestors had been. Power without restraint was the path to becoming exactly what they hated about their own past. Pointed out that despite this fear, humans still maintained overwhelming military capabilities. Their fleets were larger and more powerful than any other civilization. Their weapons could annihilate entire species. How did they justify this if they truly wanted peace? Daniel explained the difference between strength and aggression. He said that the universe was a dangerous place. Humans had learned this through bitter experience. They had been attacked and nearly destroyed more than once. They would never allow themselves to be victims again. So they built weapons and ships and defenses that could protect them from any threat. But there was a difference between being strong enough to defend yourself and being so strong that you became the threat to everyone else. Daniel described the rules that governed human civilization. They did not conquer other species. They did not colonize inhabited worlds. They did not interfere with developing civilizations. And they absolutely did not strike first. These rules were not suggestions. They were laws enforced with the full weight of human authority. Anyone who violated them faced severe punishment, regardless of their rank or position. Asked what happened if another species struck first. What if someone was foolish enough to attack humanity? Daniel's expression changed. The warmth faded from his eyes and something cold took its place. He said that if anyone attacked humanity, the response would be swift and absolute. They would end the threat quickly and completely. They would make sure every civilization within communication range knew exactly what had happened and why. Deterrence only worked if the consequences were certain and total. Felt a chill run through his body. The casual way Daniel discussed the annihilation of entire species was deeply disturbing. He had heard boastful military commanders from many civilizations. They spoke of their power with pride and arrogance. Daniel was different. He spoke of destruction the way a doctor might speak of removing a disease. It was not personal. It was not emotional. It was simply necessary when the situation required it. Said that he was beginning to understand. Humans were not conquerors because they chose not to be. They were not peaceful because they lacked the ability to make war. They were something far more dangerous. They were apex predators who had learned to wear the mask of civilization. Beneath that mask was something that could destroy anything that threatened it without hesitation or remorse. Daniel smiled at this, but there was no warmth in the expression. He confirmed that had finally grasped the truth. Humans had looked into the darkness within themselves. They had made peace with it and learned to control it, but they had never eliminated it. That darkness was still there, waiting to be unleashed if the situation ever demanded it. and when it was unleashed, nothing in the universe could stand against it. Daniel finished his drink and set the glass down. He told that he hoped they would take this lesson home with them. Humanity wanted peace. They genuinely desired friendly relations with other civilizations, but they would never sacrifice their security for the sake of appearing gentle. The choice was simple: be their friend and prosper, be their enemy and cease to exist. There was no middle ground. The delegation prepared to leave Earth on the 7th day of their visit. Their ships had been refueled with energy reserves far greater than what they had arrived with. Human engineers had offered to upgrade their navigation systems, but had politely refused. He did not want human technology embedded in vessels, no matter how beneficial it might be. Some gifts carried prices that were not immediately visible. High Commander stood on the observation deck of the Endurance for one final meeting. Earth turned slowly below him, blue and green and covered with the lights of billions of souls. He had come here expecting to find primitives. He had found something that all his expectations and assumptions. Admiral Daniel Grant stood beside him, along with Ambassador Park and Commander Cole. The three humans waited in comfortable silence, giving time to gather his thoughts. Finally spoke. He said that when he returned to the Dominion, his leaders would demand a full report. They would want to know everything he had learned during his time on Earth. They would ask him what conclusions he had drawn and what recommendations he would make. He asked the humans what message they wanted him to carry back to his people. Considered the question carefully before answering. He said that should tell them the truth, exactly as he had experienced it. Humans were dangerous, not because they sought conflict or desired conquest, but because they had mastered the art of war completely. They had looked into the darkest parts of their own nature and had made peace with what they found there. They understood exactly what they were capable of doing and had chosen to restrain themselves. But that restraint was a choice, not a limitation. It could be revoked at any moment if circumstances required it. Daniel added his own thoughts. He said that if any civilization was ever foolish enough to threaten humanity, to endanger their people or their worlds or their way of life, the response would be total. There would be no negotiation once the attack began. There would be no second chances offered. There would be no survivors left to try again. Humanity had learned through long and painful experience that some threats could not be bargained with. They could only be eliminated completely. Turned to face the three humans directly. He said that they spoke of restraint, but their words carried the weight of genocide. He was not accusing them, merely observing the truth of what they were saying. How could they claim to be civilized while holding such absolute destruction in reserve? Answered this time. Her voice was quiet but steady. She said that they did not call it genocide. They called it consequence. Humans did not hate other species. They did not wish harm upon anyone. They genuinely hoped that they would never have to use the weapons they had built. But they had learned through bitter experience that some threats could not be reasoned with or negotiated with or rehabilitated. Some threats had to be removed from existence so they could never threaten anyone again. If that made humans monsters in the eyes of other civilizations, then so be it. They would rather be feared and alive than loved and extinct. Stood in silence for a long moment, processing everything he had heard during his visit. Then he did something that surprised all three humans. He bowed deeply in the manner of his people when acknowledging a superior force. It was not a gesture of surrender, but rather one of respect for power that exceeded his own. He told them that he would recommend adding humanity to the restricted contact list maintained by the Dominion. He would advise that no vessel ever approach human territory without explicit invitation. He would suggest that the Dominion make no moves that could be interpreted as threatening by human observers. This was not cowardice. It was wisdom. Some forces were simply too great to challenge. Daniel nodded and said that this would be a wise decision. Then he asked if had any final questions before departing. Hesitated. There was one thing he still wanted to know. He asked if humanity had ever encountered something that truly threatened them, something that made them afraid. With all their power and all their technology, had they ever faced an enemy that made them doubt their survival? The three humans exchanged glances before Daniel answered. He said that yes, there had been one such enemy. About 12,000 years ago, human sensors detected a signal coming from the void between galaxies. Something was out there in the empty darkness, moving toward their region of space. The signal was ancient beyond comprehension. Whatever was sending it had been traveling for millions of years, and it was hungry for something that only living worlds could provide. Humanity had spent 3,000 years preparing for the arrival of this entity. They built weapons on a scale never before attempted. They constructed defensive installations around every inhabited world. They trained entire generations for a war they hoped would never come. But it did come. The thing from the void arrived at the edge of human space and began its assault. Daniel said the war lasted 11 days. His voice was flat as he described it. Human fleets engaged the enemy across a front spanning hundreds of light years. Weapons capable of destroying stars were deployed without hesitation. Entire solar systems were sacrificed to slow the enemy's advance. The casualties were beyond counting. Trillions of humans died in those 11 days. Worlds that had been home to billions became tombs in an instant. But humanity won. They stopped the thing from the void and destroyed it utterly. They burned its remains so thoroughly that not a single atom was left intact. They built monuments to their fallen that could be seen from 1,000 light years away. And they swore an oath that was carved into the stone of every human world. Never again would anything threaten humanity's existence. They would become strong enough to face any enemy, no matter how ancient or powerful. They would never be prey again. Daniel told that this was why humanity was what it was now. The war against the void had forged them into something harder and more dangerous than anything else in the galaxy. They had stared into the absolute worst the universe had to offer and had refused to blink. Now they stood watch over their region of space, ready to face whatever came next. Absorbed this final revelation in silence. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the shuttle that would return him to his fleet. He had learned everything he needed to know. Humanity was not simply a powerful civilization. They were survivors of horrors that would have destroyed any other species, and that survival had made them into something that ordinary understanding. As the ships engaged their fold drives and vanished from human space, Park stood beside Daniel Grant and watched the stars return to their normal patterns. Asked if Daniel thought they would heed the warning they had been given. Daniel shrugged slightly. He said that some would understand and stay away. Others would eventually test humanity's resolve. They always did. There was always some civilization that believed itself special enough to be the exception. There was always some leader who thought they could succeed where others had failed. Asked what would happen when that day came, Daniel turned from the viewport and began walking toward the bridge. His boots echoed in the empty corridor. He said that when that day came, humanity would do what it had always done. They would remind the galaxy why the primitive apes of Earth should never be underestimated. They would write another lesson in fire and darkness for all to see. And they would continue watching the void, waiting for the next threat that dared to challenge their existence. The stars shone cold and silent outside the viewport. Somewhere out there, other civilizations were learning about the species called humanity. Some would become friends, some would become enemies, and some would become memories, nothing more than cautionary tales whispered between the stars. But humanity would endure. They always had, they always would.